Okay, our audience is filing in, and I'm conscious that we always try and finish inside an hour, so I'm going to begin speaking. Good afternoon to everybody in Europe, and good afternoon to those joining in North America. As always, my name is Barry Colfer, and I'm a research fellow in politics at St Edmund's College at the University of Cambridge, along with Professor Eugenio Biagini, who you can also see on your screens. We're the co-conveners of the Cambridge series on the future of the island of Ireland, and we're delighted you can join us for this, our 6th meeting of this series and the first of the new term. So in a moment, I will hand you over to Professor Richard Penty, who's a master of Sidney Sussex College, who will introduce our speaker tonight, Sir David Lidington, an alumnus of that august place. And his discussant today will be Professor Eugenio Biagini. Before then, I want to briefly mention 2 items of housekeeping, and then to let you know what's happening in the coming weeks and months with the series. So as regards housekeeping, as always, as mentioned a moment ago, we're going to finish inside an hour. So after Professor Penty's introductory remarks, David will intervene for up to 10 minutes. David has penned a short paper, which will be circulating via our website in the coming days. David's intervention will be followed by a discussion until about 1/2 the hour with Professor Biagini, and this should then allow up to 25 minutes for the all-important questions and answers. The questions and answers function is enabled, so please do use it as always to submit questions. I'll be looking at it for the next 30 minutes, gathering up as many as I can. Please remember to keep questions as short and to the point as possible. Please state your affiliation if you have one, and if you feel it's relevant. So finally, from me, until after the discussion, as regards scheduling, between now and Christmas, we'll be hearing from a great range of speakers, including Claire Hanna, MP, on the 4th of October, Julian Smith, MP, the MP for Skipton and Ripton, but also former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland on the 11th of October, Bertie Ahern on the 18th of October, Eileen Weir from the Shankill Women's Centre on the 25th of October. And then I won't give dates, but between now and Christmas, we'll have Lord Robin Eames, John Bruton, Hugo McNeil, the outgoing chair of the British Irish Association, McCarthy TD, Ivana Bacik TD, and Doug Beattie, MLA, to name only a few. Alas, there are only so many Mondays in a year, and we'll be continuing in the new year, potentially at least partly in person in Cambridge. Who knows? I will share a link to our website at the Centre for Geopolitics in a moment, where you can find out more about the events coming up and how to register. And you can also see recordings from past meetings and papers when they're available. So if you'd like to get in touch, or if you have any questions, if you want to get on our mailing list, I'll also share my email in the chat box in a moment. So without further ado, I hand you over to Professor Penty, and many thanks for being with us.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce both Sir David Lidington and also Professor Eugenio Biagini, who are going to be speaking to us all tonight. It's promising to be a really fascinating hour ahead of us, so I'll try to take as little of it as possible, of course. And I think the reason I've been asked to introduce it is because both David is an alumnus of Sidney Sussex and Eugenio is a fellow of Sidney Sussex, so it's wonderful to see them combine this evening. Now, of course, David has had a very long and distinguished career. Currently, he's chair of the Royal United Services Institute and also the UK chair of the Koningswinter Conference and the Aurora Forum, and a trustee of the Institute of Government, for Government, sorry. But of course, David, his main claim to fame is that he served for 28 years as MP for Aylsebury, and 20 years of that was on the front bench. He's spent 4 years as Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and in government was Minister for Europe for 6 years, and then successively Leader of the House of Commons, the Justice Secretary, and Minister for the Cabinet Office. And in particular, in that last role, he held responsibility for constitutional affairs, including devolution settlements, and also deputised for Theresa May at Prime Minister's Question Time. Eugenio Biagini is, as I said, a fellow at Sidney Sussex. He's also a professor in the Faculty of History and Professor of Modern and Contemporary History. And his research focuses on the social, economic and political history of democracy, but his main area of research, of course, has been around that in Ireland, and he's written several books and on British democracy and Irish nationalism, and also examined the way Irish Home Rule campaigns affected the making of democracy in our two islands. So I'll pass over to David. We're really looking forward to hearing from you, and thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. It's great to be back at Sydney, albeit virtually rather than in person, such are circumstances. What I want to do is to reflect on how far we've got to with reconciling people in Northern Ireland in recent decades, and what needs to be done, particularly in terms of the bilateral relationship between London and Dublin, to try to create a genuinely shared society. I don't think we should underrate what has been achieved. When I was elected as a Member of Parliament for the first time in 1992, the first thing that I was issued with alongside my parliamentary pass was a mirror on the end of a telescopic pole so that I could check underneath my car every day before using it, in case a bomb had been planted underneath. Anybody who has been involved in politics as recently as the 1990s, let alone the previous decades, will have acted, lived, spoken with an acute awareness of, and to some extent under the shadow of, the campaigns of violence that were going on from different terrorist groups in Northern Ireland. And you now have a whole generation who have grown up not knowing that, no memory whatsoever of the troubles in their own lives, just something in the history books. But still many people, whether on the Unionist or on the Nationalist and Republican side in Northern Ireland, who have family stories, whose circle of friends has been horribly affected by the violence of the Troubles, and of course many people who still bear the physical or psychological scars to this day. Now, clearly, if we look at where we are now, we've come a long way, but we are not at a shared society. Anybody from England, Wales or Scotland who goes to Belfast is still shocked, I think, by the peace walls dividing Loyalist from Republican estates in parts of North and West Belfast in particular. And even though the worst of the sectarian graffiti has been removed, that underlying sense of a society where people are of different traditions rather than genuinely shared societies stays to today. Now, Brexit has, to some considerable extent, made things even more sensitive, because Britain leaving the European Union and its single market and customs union was bound to create a dilemma about where in those circumstances the normal international checks, controls, inspections that apply across a border should be carried out. And any such discussion in the Northern Ireland context immediately takes you to questions not just of physical location or burdens on business, real though those are, and important though those are, but touch on issues of identity. We now have a Northern Ireland where roughly the same proportion of the population thinks of themselves as British and Unionist and thinks of themselves as Irish and Nationalist, with between 12 and 20% unaligned or in the middle in some way. So the union depends on having enough moderate nationalist and unaligned people prepared to go along with it, because actually letting sleeping dogs lie is the best option. That people can live their lives as Irish men and women within what is the United Kingdom, but without the border making any practical or big psychological difference in how they go about their lives, do their shopping, visit people, and so on. And of course, any talk of border controls, inspections, infrastructure, reawakened all those concerns about what that would mean. Now, these things should have been recognised and addressed much earlier on. I won't labour the point, but I think I was one of those who, when I went and campaigned for Remain in 2016 in Northern Ireland, did flag this as an important issue. What was clear, though, is that if I think back at my time in government, there was a shift in Irish policy in about 2016. And it's before Enda Kenny left office. This isn't something just to blame on Leo Varadkar. And the decision was made to press the EU's negotiating position to include dealing with the Northern Ireland border in the withdrawal agreement and make a deal on that a key element as a core EU objective, without which no negotiated withdrawal agreement would be possible at all. I remember asking Ollie Robbins, who was Theresa May's chief negotiator at one point, how on earth this added up legally, because surely, given WTO rules, all external borders had to be administered in the same way. And the EU was saying every other UK border with the EU has to wait until the future relationship talks start. And the answer was that the EU had decided on two principles: necessity and proportionality, which justified treating Northern Ireland as a special case. The peace process and political stability in Northern Ireland was a vital core interest of the Union, so special treatment was necessary, and trade across the border was such a tiny fraction of EU-UK trade, let alone the single market as a whole, that it was proportionate to make that border a special case. Now, the outcome of those negotiations is very well known, and I think it's clear to me, working very closely with Theresa May, a passionate unionist, is that she understood the point about anything to do with the border touching on identity. And what made the biggest impact on her were the meetings with moderate nationalist groups, where people said to her pretty plainly that anything that made it harder for those who thought of themselves as Irish to let sleeping dogs lie would add to the campaign and political pressure for a border poll, and in her view, put at risk the Union. That's on top of knowing that border controls north-south would be unenforceable, and all the meetings I had with business leaders and community leaders in Derry, Londonderry, in Newry, and Enniskillen all reinforced that perspective. Now, we didn't succeed in Theresa's time in persuading enough people, either the DUP or the enough conservative backbenchers, to support the backstop compromise that we had negotiated. I think it's worth stating that we did offer to the DUP to keep Great Britain allied to Northern Ireland's, and therefore to a considerable extent the EU's regulatory standards, for as long as any backstop was in operation, and to give Stormont representatives an effective veto over the UK government's positions in the Joint Committee. And in parallel, we made a lot of progress with Michel Barnier's team on agreeing a dedramatisation of controls, so if the backstop were triggered, checks would largely be carried out in the market or the place of manufacture or assembly of industrial goods. Now, we know that those efforts failed. And there are various reasons for this, which we might want to go into. I think the Commission did make a bad error of judgment in going public with their proposed draft protocol text. And although I like and respect Michel Barnier, I think he never really thought himself inside the skin of mainstream unionists. And my hopes that unionists might be persuaded to accept this sort of compromise were dashed, and things like the RHI scandal, which weakened the authority of the DUP leadership, no doubt played a factor in that. When Boris Johnson came to power, I was frankly surprised when he agreed what is now the Northern Ireland Protocol, because it did mean a permanent, not temporary alignment for Northern Ireland with many single market regulations. The Stormont lock, the 1994 vote, was a win for him, but it's very hard, given the demographics of Northern Ireland, to see that there would be a majority in the Assembly to ditch a protocol then. And I think what we saw initially back in December, or it was more November in 2019, and then we've seen again since the EU's clumsy talk about triggering Article 16 in January this year, is real unionist rage. There's a genuine political problem in Northern Ireland, where the protocol now risks becoming the key issue of the Stormont election next year, and opinion dividing along sectarian lines. Now, what I think makes handling this even more difficult is that this is coming at a time when, because of Brexit, British and Irish ministers and officials are not meeting each other week in, week out, as we used to do at council meetings, in the margins of council meetings, the permanent conversations in different forums through which EU business is always done, in the EU caucus in the margins of a NATO or OSCE meeting, or at the UN, the little chats over coffee or lunch, the calls from capital to capital to try and sort out EU business, agree a qualified majority or a blocking minority on the council. All those conversations build up a relationship, build up trust. That's now all gone. And of course, the last 5 years have bruised the London-Dublin relationship. So I think we need to get to grips with how we rebuild trust and an effective bilateral relationship. Now, that has to start with the protocol. I think till we do that, the other measures are not going to work. And it's neither in Britain's nor Ireland's interests to let those divisions over the protocol fester. I think for the UK, that compromise has to involve accepting the implications of the protocol that the British government negotiated and ratified. And since most checks and paperwork concern food and agriculture, I'd like to see some kind of self-standing, time-limited treaty between the UK and the EU to agree in detail on sanitary and phytosanitary standards that reflect the standards now in force under both European and UK law. And it wouldn't be an infringement of UK sovereignty, because negotiating and ratifying an international treaty is surely a fundamental expression of sovereignty. But I think the EU needs to compromise too. And it's going back to Barnier's ideas about de-dramatisation. I think it should bring forward the bespoke solutions that have been drafted to deal with things such as the supply of medical drugs from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. But also, I would like to see the Commission come forward with practical measures to de-dramatise paperwork and inspection, so they're just less onerous for business and for consumers. And if they agree a compromise of that kind, what the EU would be doing is applying those same principles of necessity and proportionality that its negotiators frequently cited during the negotiations in 2017 and 18. And those principles, if they were relevant then, seem to me to be as relevant today as they were 4 years ago. Second, I think London and Dublin need to establish a new pattern of bilateral relationships that require structured contact between the two governments. These might even be incorporated into a new bilateral treaty between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. Perhaps an annual summit between Taoiseach and Prime Minister, a joint cabinet meeting, a structured dialogue on security threats, both internal and external, a secondment programme for officials to spend 6 or 12 months working for the other government. And we also need to try to make Strand 3 institutions more vigorous. I frankly think it's quite hard to think how you change the British-Irish Council, and you've got there the devolved administrations in the UK, the 3 Crown dependencies, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man, and you might perhaps have more bilateral discussions between government ministers in London and Dublin in the margins of BIC, but I can't see it going much beyond that. But I think the British-Irish Intergovernmental Council is a different matter. And we could be more ambitious. I mean, while Theresa May's government was so dependent on DUP votes in the Commons, it wasn't possible to push this forward as much as I personally would have wished. And I think it is dismaying that the Johnson government's first British-Irish Intergovernmental Council with Irish ministers took place only in June this year, almost 2 years after the government took office, the British government took office. So I would like to see the BIIGC meet regularly, once a quarter, and it needs to become a routine, extremely boring, almost unnoticeable part of intergovernmental business. We need to stop treating its meetings like a big political event. And there's lots of practical issues to discuss, like how you coordinate what Ireland's doing to regenerate its northwest with the UK city deal for Derry, Londonderry and Strabane. I mean, those are 2 projects that ought to be developed in close harmony with one another for obvious reasons. And finally, I think we should take a fresh look at parliamentary relationships. I mean, the current body does good work, but I wonder how many TDs or MPs know much about its existence. And it can't be for governments to tell parliaments what to do, but you might, for example, have a regular annual meeting between the speakers and more frequent contact between committee chairs in Parliament and in the Oireachtas. So I think we need to beef up Strand 3 relations, handling it with all sensitivity and respect to what under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement should properly be Strand 1 or Strand 2 work. But mutual trust between Dublin and London, understanding each other's positions, is vital to helping support elected leaders in Northern Ireland to continue work to try to build a genuinely shared society. And if we get that trust between governments built up, I think that will help too the work that the churches, the work that civil society is undergoing painstakingly week by week to try to rebuild trust that has sadly been bruised in recent years, and even before the referendum, even before Brexit, was very far from creating a genuinely shared society. Eugenia, I will stop there. Let's chat about things. And well, I welcome questions.
Eugenio.
Thank you. Well, David, many thanks for this lucid and constructive analysis of the current situation and how we got into it. As you said, there were at various stages different options and opportunities open to us, but we consistently opted for the least manageable one, and the one most likely to cause diplomatic instability and the backlash. And it is important to understand why. The fundamental problem is that Brexit is about erecting hard or harder borders. This was bound to affect our relations with the European Union in various areas, but most significantly and immediately in Northern Ireland, as you noted at the time and indeed a few minutes ago. Expecting that Brexit would not affect existing peace process arrangements was more or less like putting up a wall between your back garden and that of your next door neighbors, and then complain that it creates a visual, emotional, and physical barrier between you and them. Now we are trying to open little windows into this wall. Your three proposals, just to sum them up: time-limited treaty on sanitary standards in exchange for supplies and medical drugs, pattern of bilateral UK-Ireland regular contacts through stand-free institutions, and three, increasing or strengthening the parliamentary relationships. Well, they are essential, especially number one. I think it is essential, and the other two would be important in order to support whatever agreement is reached. However, together they would probably have the potential of solving at least some of the technical problems affecting Northern Ireland. But any solution to technical problems, however intrinsically ingenious, requires a political will. And this brings us to the question of whether checks are enforceable. In 2016, Teresa Villiers, in reply to some comments you made, answered that border arrangements, quote, have been broadly consistent in the 100 years since the creation of Ireland as a separate state, but this claim does not match any evidence which is remotely relevant to the question. In fact, border arrangements changed several times. In the years after partition, there was plenty of friction due to border controls which were enforceable, and Protestant community in the Irish Free State south of the border mentioned trade and commerce as arguments to demand their inclusion into Northern Ireland, the move of these areas into Northern Ireland when giving evidence to the 1925 Field Commission. They repeatedly cited being cut off from their suppliers and difficulty with reaching their markets. Now, there is little to suggest, however, that their demands and complaints had any effect, because there was no will that they would. In fact, in 1934, the British Finance Act changed again the border and created an area of 40 miles along the border. This was a British act in which the burden fell on the owners of goods and animals to prove that these animals had not been imported illegally. And then came together with this one the De Valera's Coal Cattle Pact, which is more or less like proposal number 1 in your 3 proposals, except that now Boris Johnson is De Valera, and we try to get some cattle into the other side in exchange from coal. You say the border controls are unenforceable, but they were very enforceable before 1973, despite the high level of smuggling, and became even more enforceable between 1973 and 1998, when this became a militarized frontier. It is, of course, a different argument to say that we do not want to return to enforcing controls and the hard border. But asking what we do want and what we do not want is a crucial question in politics, and it is a question of political will. Specifically, how do we assess the political will in our case? The whole history of British-Irish relations, even before the end of the Union in 1920, shows that positive results follow a government's investment of time, political capital, and expertise into the region. Now, do we have at this point in time any evidence of such investment? Does the present government show any signs of staffing the Northern Ireland office is a priority? Since the Brexit referendum, there have been 5 different holders of the position of Secretary of State, on average each serving about 18 months. And this is for an office which is much more than a technical department. It's more like appointing a psychotherapist. And you don't change your psychotherapist every now and then, because you need to build a trust relationship with him or with her. Furthermore, these appointments were not consistently made with a view to selecting someone who will leave a mark on the shaping of UK-Irish relations. In fact, in February 2020, after the dismissal of Julian Smith as Secretary of State, the SDLP leader Colum Eastwood described the move as showing dangerous indifference, I quote, on the side of the Prime Minister. Then during the long Brexit negotiations, as you already said, this continued. So the question is whether now we have the political will to show a commitment to solving any problems, whether arising from the protocol or any other problems in Northern Ireland. And this question affects the other question which you mentioned, and that is about trust. Trust is crucial, as Julian Smith has recently said in a tweet. We cannot build trust unless we convey the impression that solving Northern Ireland problems is a priority and that the government is committed. So this takes me to some questions. First of all, do you think that we shall be able to summon the political will to make your proposals work, or any other proposals for that matter? And of course, this goes together with the other question which you raised already, or the other essential point which both you and I had mentioned, rebuilding trust. And you said that this was preliminary to what civil society can do. But then, is there a way in which civil society, the chambers of commerce, or the churches, as you said, could take the initiative? After all, at the very beginning of, even before the beginning of the peace process, it was a Methodist minister, Eric Gallagher, who first started to talk to the IRA. This was in 1972, when the idea of talking to terrorists was altogether taboo. And of course, this was essential to the solution, to finding any solution in Northern Ireland. So what can and what should church leaders and social society and civil society leaders do in order to improve the situation on the centenary of the foundation of Northern Ireland?
Yep. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, Eugenio, I will try to keep them. It's a very interesting response, and I want to try and keep my response to you brief without sort of failing to do it justice. I'm not going to defend Brexit. I mean, my views on that are better record, pretty well known and often repeated. But we are where we are, and I think that the key thing now for both Brussels and for London is to contemplate what the alternatives are to failing to find a mutually acceptable compromise. I think, in fairness, I think that the Irish government, I think for the most part, does grasp this, and I think my old friend Maros Šefčovič, I think is very pragmatic. Though he will deliver on whatever mandate he's been given, but it seems to me he's making a genuine effort to reach out. But at the moment, if I look forward, it is pretty grim. If nothing else changes, we have opinion in Northern Ireland is becoming more polarized, and that is as we head into an election for Stormont. I fear it is now more likely than not that the devolved institutions will collapse within the next 9 to 12 months. It could be sooner, could be later, but I think that is now a very real prospect, which means all decisions revert to London, to Westminster, and that in itself will then generate new tensions, because there will be calls from nationalists and Republicans for, in effect, joint governments to be introduced from London and Dublin. That's not going to happen, and I can just see things could slide even further in terms of trust. And I think if I have criticism of both the UK government and of the 27 and the Commission, it is that not just with Northern Ireland, but I think generally post-Brexit, there has been a failure to think enough strategically about what they each want the long-term relationship between them to be, given that we're going to be living next door to each other and we will remain very important politically and economically to one another for as far ahead as we can possibly predict. Now, I take the view, take your questions. On political will, I think that at the moment, there is little obvious sign, that I have sensed hints from both sides, the willingness to move, I think, in what Vice President Šefčovič has said about the EU being willing to change EU law, which was a move beyond what had previously been the Commission's position. I think in some of the hints that I have heard from senior UK officials about being prepared, what is meant by looking at bespoke solutions, they're not interesting. They are not talking about revoking the protocol, which I think is quite significant. So I think there is hope there. My worry is that there is not sufficient political priority being given to this. And I think that principle of necessity that I referred to earlier is something that both the Commission and the UK government need to take to heart, because it seems to me it is an absolutely essential core interest of both, and of the Irish government in particular, within the EU, that that a way is found to try to buttress the peace process and the process of reconciliation within Northern Ireland. At the moment, things are going in the opposite direction, with polarisation around the issue of the protocol that looks as if it's going to be the defining issue of a Stormont election next year, which is incredibly bad news. And with some unionist politicians saying very openly that they would simply refuse, if they were in the executive, to cooperate with implementing any part of the protocol in terms of its practical operation. So I think that it is getting that principle of necessity and proportionality into the forefront of people's minds that is key. And I think there's some slight hints there, but I think that I really do think we do need to see a further focus on this. And secondly, on your point about civil society and the churches, I think they need to carry on patiently doing what they have been doing. and just building up contact and relationships, particularly at local level, and sometimes providing channels to political leaders that make it possible for some of the people that are right out on the fringes to come in. So it's not just church leaders in Northern Ireland, but certainly the Archbishop of Canterbury's team have been very helpful in providing channels to some of those groups in Northern Ireland through working with the Northern Ireland churches. And so I think that there are important steps that can be taken that way, but I don't think civil society or the churches on their own can do this. I think without a rebuilding of trust and relationships between the two governments, that it is only going to be a matter of sort of first aid to some pretty deep scars, and so it helps. It's better, a lot better than nothing. It can be the prelude, and it can help build up political trust. The churches can go to governments and say, look, we think you ought to be talking to these people. We think that there is perhaps some scope for discussion here. But at the end of the day, it's got to be the political leaders who take responsibility.
You'd have time for one more riposte, Eugenio, if you wish. Otherwise, we can move to the Q&A.
Very briefly.
I recognise the look in your face.
One is about the position and the crucial role of the Secretary of State in Northern Ireland. Don't you think he should be, he or she, whoever is appointed, should be given, first of all, longer time to get to grips with the problems in Northern Ireland, and there should be a commitment to allow the Secretary of State to operate with some degree of autonomy, whether or not the Prime Minister likes what he or she does in office. And that is because the results in achieving results in this area are of crucial importance for this country. And the other consideration, you mentioned the elections next year in Stormont. There is also the scenario that there will be a situation in which Sinn Féin will be the largest party, and perhaps the governing party in the Republic, as well as in the North, which would not make the task of negotiating anything any easier. So this is a window of opportunity ahead of us, which must be, it is essential we make use of.
I completely agree with you on that second point. I think actually the prospect of, given the divisions within unionism at the moment, it does look as if Sinn Féin might well emerge as the largest single party and therefore entitled to nominate the First Minister. And I think it's an open question at this stage whether any unionist party would be prepared to take office with them in those circumstances. There's indications from the UUP they might, but I think the DUP and the TUV are being pretty clear that they would not go into government under such conditions. So I think there are some real tensions there. On your point about the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I agree with you. My view is in general for all senior government positions, ministers should be left in post for longer than is often the way with the UK system. But I think that is particularly so of Northern Ireland. And I have a lot of time for Brandon Lewis. I mean, I worked with him closely when he's in a different role in government. I think he is a sensible, level-headed guy. But I thought it was a great shame that Julian Smith was removed when he worked with Simon Coveney to get the devolved institutions back up and running, and he really got to grips with relationships between different politicians, parties, and other groups within Northern Ireland. And it's no disparagement of Brandon to say, actually, when you've just got a Secretary of State who's just worked himself into the job in that way, then to move him as a great pity.
Great. We'll move on to the next, the final part of proceedings, and I'm delighted, obviously, to remind everyone that Julian Smith will be with us on the 11th of October. So, David, we have I've grouped questions into 4 themes. Whether we get through the 4 of them or not will depend, I guess, on the length of our answers. The first group are on UK politics / public opinion. The second group is on Northern Irish politics in particular. The third group will be about, I think the last two are actually only single questions. So the penultimate group will be on UK Anglo-Irish relations. And finally, there's a question on the European angle. So bear with me as I loop three questions together.
That's fine.
From Matthew Bullock, he asks, does the English public care much about what happens in Northern Ireland and their eventual outcomes? And relatedly, almost continuing this kind of train of thought, Brian Ing says, do you think this government are likely to take Northern Irish affairs seriously, given that this government are apparently focused on getting re-elected? And finally, in this trinity, to put a slightly more kind of optimistic take, Hugo McNeill, the current chair of the British Irish Association, says, you mentioned how people in the rest of the UK have become less interested in Northern Ireland. What are the practical ways that leaders of unionism could reverse or at least address this? Everyone will understand if you want to take 30 seconds to gather your thoughts.
Yeah. Right, how long have we got? Do the English public care? Well, I mean, and actually, this would apply to the Welsh public or the Scottish public as well. Not very much is the brutal truth. And I think you look at the opinion polls, and you see that again and again. I think in passing that there's a particular problem for UK unionists as a whole. I'm talking about this in the broader context, not just Northern Ireland context, of English public opinion becoming indifferent to the union. After all, England on its own would be bigger than all but I think the three largest member states of the European Union. They're both in population and GDP terms. I think only Germany, France, and Italy would be larger than England on its own. So there is this sort of sense, well, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, they're taking our money, and these people in Northern Ireland just they're talking about things we don't really understand, and why can't they sort themselves out? If you went into a pub or a public meeting in lots of parts of England, that's the sort of response that you would get. But I think political leaders have a responsibility to go beyond that. You mustn't be driven by that indifference. Because what happens in Northern Ireland matters to the security and the prosperity of the UK as a whole, and also Northern Ireland. The people, regardless of whether they're orange or green, what they lived through for decades during the Troubles has left a legacy of not just physical and psychological scarring on individuals and families, but of course a legacy of sort of economic disadvantage that has not been overcome completely in the years since 1998, although there has been huge economic growth and regeneration since then. But there is still that legacy that goes back to the Troubles, when frankly you had to be extraordinarily courageous to think about investing in Northern Ireland, starting a new business there. So they don't care as much as I wish they did. The government, I think, governments want to get elected, but having bits of the country at risk of flaking off, or having a part of the country where there is ongoing tension is not good for any government that wants to get re-elected. And actually, in fairness to I look at the present British cabinet, I disagreed with them on Brexit. As I say, we are where we are. They won the referendum, and I think that they are for the most part genuine unionists, and they do want this to find a way to make this work. And I think Johnson showed in the latter months of 2019, when he did the deal with Leo Varadkar and then with the Commission, that he is willing to move, sometimes quite dramatically, in order to close down an issue, reach an agreement that then frees him, gives him more time and energy to spend on those domestic issues, levelling up, infrastructure, educational standards, housing, that really will matter in terms of votes at a 2024 or 2023 general election. On unionism, I think that there has been a lack of sufficient strategic thinking within unionism about how you build support for the union in a Northern Ireland where unionists no longer have a majority. And I think part of that is about reaching out to people in the rest of the United Kingdom, as well as ensuring that you are working on relationships between communities within Northern Ireland. And I think that it means getting involved more in contributing ideas for debates at Westminster and in Great Britain about some of these domestic issues. For example, there are some very interesting, successful saving schemes, friendly societies, and the like in Northern Ireland. There are some brilliant chambers of trade. I mean, Newry Chamber of Commerce, when I was Shadow Secretary of State, I was just hugely impressed. Basically, the business leaders in the city had decided we're not going to wait for the politicians to get their act together. We're going to get on and do things and try and get business and jobs into Newry. And there's some things there, some stuff from Northern experience that I think could be useful being shared with the rest of the UK. And I think that I would like to see at UK level the government convene more sort of city forums and so on. Actually, you bring Belfast and Londonderry in to sit with Andy Burnham and Andy Street and Ben Houchin, or the Provost of Glasgow, or whoever. So you've actually got cities from different parts of the UK talking city to city and swapping experiences, rather than just putting Northern Ireland into this little pigeonhole the whole time. And it's trying to get Northern Ireland, the civil service, as well as the politicians, out of this rather inward-looking tradition that I think has grown up over for some decades now.
Okay, extremely interesting. We shall push on. I've a question from myself, indulging myself. In your short paper that I've had a look at, and the rest of the audience will have the chance before the weekend, you say that regarding the border, and then Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Theresa Villiers, they said that there'd be no problem and that there was no reason to expect border arrangements to change. Clearly, even at the time, to anyone with any understanding of the island of Ireland, this was at best unacceptable in terms of a lack of understanding of your brief, or at worst it was perfidious. So I'm trying to be a little bit provocative. Which one do you think it was? Did Theresa Villiers fail to understand the realities of the border, or was there wool being pulled over eyes?
I think it was. I don't think it was perfidious. I think it was a less a failure to understand the border as a failure to understand how the single market works, and that because the fact that the EU is based upon a system of laws or rules that apply to everybody, because that is the only way it can operate. The whole point of the EU is it has a set of common rules that means even Germany or France has to stick to them and can have enforcement action taken against them if they transgress. And I think it was not understanding how the single market operates, and what therefore the inevitable logical consequence of Brexit would be, that was the flaw here. And you talk to plenty of people on the Brexit side who say, oh yeah, well, we have the same standards. We have that. Everybody trusts our inspections and so on. We should just carry on as we always have done. No, it wasn't going to be that simple. And I think that was the flaw.
Okay, fair cop. We'll move on to the next theme, David, which is on Northern Irish politics. And I'm going to yoke two questions together, if I may. One is from Kate Arthur, and it's something that you brushed upon in your conversation with Eugenio. Do you think that the churches still have the relevance or nous to play the sort of role they played in the past? This is very topical, obviously, given there's a storm underway in Ireland regarding the president that you're probably aware of. You don't need to speak about it.
Yep.
But by all means do. And then secondly, if I may, kind of similar enough tack from John Cartledge, who's one of our kind of regular attendees. Hello, John. To what extent is the persistence of segregated education inimical to the deep tribalisation of Northern Irish society and politics? There are two questions specific to Northern Ireland. By all means, pass either, but if you have something...
Yeah. Right, and each worth at least half a day's seminar in their own right. I think on Kate's point about the churches, look, it's clear that certainly in the Republic of Ireland, it's also true of Northern Ireland, people have become more secular in recent years, so that will diminish the authority of the churches. But against that, I think that churches are still regarded with respect and with trust in a way that few other organizations are. So I think they have a part to play. And actually, you know, my argument as a member of the Church of England is that churches should be involved in politics with a small p, not party politics, but and actually acting as facilitators, as confidential channels, and so on, is a role that they can and should seek to play in Northern Ireland. And I won't get drawn into all the detail about President Higgins' decision. Particularly, I've seen some newspaper reports, but I've been in politics long enough not to rush to a detailed judgment on the basis of a couple of newspaper articles. But I just think what that controversy shows, as the controversy a couple of years ago over the proposal that the Royal Irish Constabulary be remembered at an event in Ireland, indicate it's not just in Northern Ireland that there's still quite a lot of work to do in terms of real reconciliation, mutual understanding and respect. On John Cartledge's point about education, yes, my personal view is that I would love to wake up tomorrow morning and find that Northern Ireland had switched overnight to integrated schooling. But I know that is not going to happen. And I think, and it's there is resistance to it from both sides, both traditions in Northern Ireland. But I do think that is important. I remember going to round an integrated school a few years back in North Belfast, and I was chatting to the sixth form there, and one lad said to me he'd been brought up in the Shankill, and he'd never met a Catholic until he'd gone to this integrated school, let alone made friends with any Catholics. And you could have, and I'm sure that there were other kids at that school brought up in the Falls, Little Spring Hill Road, and same about Protestant Unionists. And that I just think we need to break down. The workplace in Northern Ireland has very successfully become a neutral space as far as the rival traditions are concerned, and I would like to see education become the same.
The very excellent universities in Northern Ireland have also...
Yes, indeed, and FE colleges too.
Sure, higher education further education.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So thank you very much there, Kate, for pointing a light on a very important topic. Penultimately, we do have time, I think. David, in a sentence or two, your time-limited treaty that you mentioned, how does this differ from the protocol?
I think the way I see it, and this is a proposal, I haven't drafted it, is that you would have a separate, it'd be a separate bilateral treaty between the United Kingdom and the European Union. The terms of the treaty would define what the standards were that both sides accepted as should apply. And it would have, as almost all international treaties do have, review clauses, exit clauses. What I'm suggesting in this case, you might have a time limit on it, something like 2025. So it came after the first proposed date for the Stormont decision on whether the protocol should continue, and that might give you breathing space for Commission and London to sit down and work out a more permanent arrangement. Now, the permanent arrangement might include a bilateral treaty on SBS as well, but I think that might be a way constitutionally of dealing with this that would get over some of the hang-ups that the British government does have about dynamic alignment. Because that it introduces an element of unpredictability, in effect saying you will be bound by whatever decision the CJEU comes up with in the future. So it's meant as a constructive, pragmatic suggestion, and it would require compromise by both sides, and there's no getting away from that. But what I'm saying is the principles of proportionality and necessity provide the legal justification for such special treatment, and the risks of descent into political instability in Northern Ireland are real, and actually there should be sort of a spur there to both sides, but both the Commission and to the UK government to find a way through.
I think the Irish Times is screaming out for a column along those lines, David. I'm sure there'll be a willing audience if you try to put pen to paper. I'm just in two minds. I'm afraid there's a question from Professor Calypso Nicolaides at the European University Institute in Florence, and I'm going to just murder it, put it into a sentence or two to see if you have a comment, David, if I may. Calypso asks pertaining to the coverage of the EU in the UK today, and she gives the example of there's sometimes a canard that 25% of the EU's border checks take place on the Irish Sea. Canard is my word, not Calypso's. Can you reflect at all on the portrayal of the EU in the UK? Has it changed at all since 2016? Is it better or worse? And can we make progress until we start kind of taking the poison out of the exchanges?
There was a British politician once who said that politicians complaining about the media is like the fish complaining about the sea, and it's I think it is, for the most part, the coverage is dire and ill-informed, but it's what it is, and I certainly don't believe that governments should intervene to try to sort of to steer the press in the right direction. I think there's sometimes an unawareness in London political circles that we in effect have a single European media these days, and European ministers, senior Commission officials get their clippings, including the UK press, and they almost all read English. So they have a usually quicker grasp of that than we have of what's being said in the newspapers. I remember going as a minister to a meeting in Bucharest, 9 o'clock in the morning, and the Romanian minister's opening words to me was, "David, before we get down to our business, can you explain to me about this article in the Daily Express this morning?" And I'm afraid, I think also the British press has always been more rude, irreverent, inclined to caricature than similar publications in most other European capitals. Being built, I can point to publications elsewhere that might be a bit more like Fleet Street, but the British press has always been that, and they've always been fiercely irreverent towards politicians, and foreign or domestic. So I think British politicians just get used to having to try and live with that. And so I think I don't think there's much can be done about it, but I'd agree it's not good coverage.
Thank you, David. You've dealt extremely well and honestly with some tricky and rapid fire questions. So just for me, I want to thank you. Thank you to the audience. I'm going to pass you over to Eugenio just for him to say a note of thanks and goodbye, whilst to put a link to our next event in the chat box. Thank you, everybody.
Well, it was a great pleasure to have you, David. And again, many thanks for your clear analysis and the elegant handling of the questions, which has made our task of understanding what's going on a little clearer. No reason to feel very encouraged by the conclusions, and never mind. As for the future talks, there are now messages coming up in the chat, and indeed you can find the full details on the website of the series. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Master.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.